welcome to Simcha, a celebration of life. I'm your host, Aaron Halevi. In today's show, we look at the role of the biblical figures of Joshua and Rahab, and we also explore Lithuania with Hugh Raichlin. In our series, Righteous Men of the Bible, Rabbi Liebenberg narrates the phenomenal story of Joshua. Displaying all the qualities of a leader and a close protege of Moses, Joshua took over the leadership of the Jewish people and led them into the Promised Land.
The Jewish Bible is made up of 3 sections. The first section being the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The second being the prophets, and the third being the writings. The very first book of the prophets is the book of Joshua. Joshua, the successor of Moses. He is one of the greatest biblical heroes who ever lived. Let's try to understand what exactly his greatness was and where he came from. Joshua was a descendant of Ephraim, one of the tribes of the Jewish people, or in particular, the son of Joseph. Joseph's tribe was split into 2, Manasseh, his eldest son, and Ephraim. And even though Ephraim was the younger child, Jacob, his grandfather, said to him, "One day you will become famous. The whole world will know about you." And this is a reference to Joshua. How did the whole world find out about Joshua? Well, we read in his book, in the book of Joshua, that there was this incredible battle that took place. One of the battles that Joshua waged so that the Jewish people could move into the land of Canaan. And he needed more time. The sun was beginning to set, but he needed more time to successfully win the battle. And miraculously, the sun stopped. The Giver, in a place called Giver, the sun stopped, and everybody found out about it. And hence, Joshua's reputation became known across the world. What was his merit? How come he came to be the successor of Moshe, the next generation of leadership amongst the Israelites? He wasn't a son of Moses. So why was it that he was selected? The Torah tells us, the Bible tells us, that when God came to Moses and said that he was going to die, Moses said back to God, "Please, don't leave the Israelites like a flock which doesn't have a shepherd. Appoint somebody over them." And our sages tell us that in the back of his mind, Moses was thinking about one of his 2 sons, either Gershom or Eliezer. And God came to him and said, "No, it's not like you think. It's not going to be your sons. They're not appropriate for the task. They're not right for that particular mission. It's going to be your disciple Joshua." And why your disciple Joshua? Because in the words of Proverbs, the one who looks after the orchard will merit to eat its fruit. This is a reference to Joshua. Joshua was always at the side of Moses. He was his closest disciple. He served him. He didn't just learn from him in a classroom situation, but he saw how Moses as a leader behaved. This is something which is called in Talmudic parlance, Shimush Talmidei Chachamim, to serve and to observe the behavior of the righteous people. And so, for example, we see that when Moshe went to wage war, Joshua was there. In the morning, Joshua would come early to the place where the people were studying, and he would set all of the tables in place. And he would be there the entire day, listening to Moses, following what he said, observing his behavior. He would be the last one there at night, putting everything back in its correct place. When Moses went on high to receive the 10 Commandments, who went with him? Again, it was Joshua. It was his loyal disciple that went with him. And therefore, God said to Moses, "Joshua has been with you every single step of the way. He has observed your behavior. He's going to take your place." And there is an analogy that is used to describe the relationship between these 2 great men. The sages tell us that Moshe was like the sun. The sun has its own powerful light that it casts throughout the galaxy. And Joshua was like the moon. The moon doesn't have its own light. It's not a star. But it takes the light of the sun and it reflects it. And so it was that Joshua reflected the light from his master, from Moses, and reflected it onto the rest of the people. But there's an incredible message that we learn from Joshua. Very often you find that in the first generation there is greatness. There's a new movement that comes on the scene, a new political movement, perhaps a new religious movement. You have this charismatic leader. You take, for example, within Jewish history, you had the Hasidic movement, the pietist movement that took place in Eastern Europe. And you had the first generation with great people, people of charisma. But there's always a worry. Is this going to continue in the second generation? Because perhaps in the second generation, people are not going to be as pious or as great or as charismatic. So often the role of the people in the second generation is stability, is consolidation, to make sure that all of the lessons that were taught in the first generation and all of that passion and energy can now be kept in place properly so that the movement can continue into the future. And I think this was the ultimate power of Joshua. He wasn't as charismatic as Moses. He didn't do perhaps as many miracles as Moses, but he took the lessons that he had learned from his teacher and he consolidated them. And he made sure that the impetus and the focus that had taken place in the first generation would not be lost. And therefore he became a very, very great leader. Because sometimes it's not about being as great as the previous generation, but just to make sure that all of the goals and the mission statements of the first generation are continued into the future. And therefore Joshua remains for the Jewish people and in fact for the entire world one of the greatest heroes of the Bible, because he could take that message that came before him and translate it into a new world.
Welcome back. We continue our series, Heritage Travels with Hugh Raichlin. The majority of the Jewish community in South Africa originally came from Lithuania in Eastern Europe, and Hugh Reichlin's family is no exception. Traveling back to his roots, Hugh shares with us his journey, which undoubtedly has contributed to a better understanding of where his family came from, and perhaps made him into the man he is today.
The first Jews came to Lithuania in about 1316. That means that in 1945, which would be the end of the Second World War, Jews had been in Lithuania for approximately 6 centuries, some 600 years that lived alongside the Lithuanian people. The Jewish community in Lithuania, at its height in about 1939, had a Jewish population of approximately 240,000 people. Now that was a relatively small community compared to the Jews of Poland, where you had approximately 3.3 million Jews on the eve of the Second World War. The two major cities in Lithuania were Kovna and Vilna, and in fact the capital of Lithuania interchanged between those two cities. Vilna, or Vilnius, was known as Yerushalayim Delita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And one of the most well-known streets in Vilna for the Jewish people was Gaono Gatva, and that was named after the Gaon of Vilna, who was actually Rabbi Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman Kramer, lived in Lithuania from 1720 and passed away in 1797. He was not only a genius in Torah studies, he also wrote on geography, trigonometry, and algebra, and many other secular subjects. The Gaon of Vilna was certainly the leading rabbi of his day and has been one of the greatest Torah authorities to come out of Eastern Europe until this very day. When we were in Vilna, we also saw Židu Street, which means Jew Street. So that's quite amazing, because today in the whole of Lithuania there are only about 5,000 Jews. Yet the Lithuanian government has kept the name Jew Street, just as they have kept the name Gaona Gatva, that's the street after the Gaon of Vilna. Many of the school children that attend the Shalom Aleichem Jewish Day School come from various Eastern European countries. Many of them have come in from Russia, so they're not from traditional Lithuanian Jewish families. And many of them are not Jewish according to strict Jewish Orthodox law. As long as one of the two parents is Jewish, the school will admit them. They learn Yiddish, they learn Hebrew, and they learn Jewish history and various other cultural subjects. The only functional synagogue in Vilna today is known as the Chor Shul. And I went to pray there one morning, and there was a man that was standing next to me, an old Jewish man, and we spoke in Yiddish, and I'm very grateful that my grandmother, my late grandmother, lived with us when I was a young man, so I was able to learn Yiddish. And he asked me if I would like the key to the grave of the Gaon of Vilna. And I thought that would be an amazing thing, and I wasn't even sure if this was the real deal and what he was really offering me. So after the synagogue service had ended that day, we walked arm in arm downstairs, and he took me to a key shop where he made me a copy of a key. And we then went to the cemetery in Vilna. It was very early in the morning. It must have been about 8 o'clock in the morning, and we were leaving at midday, so we had no time to come back. So myself and two friends foot-lifted each other over this high wall of the cemetery, jumped over and went inside, and we went to the mausoleum of the Gaon of Vilna. And it was a little house with a metal gate, and I put my key in the gate and it opened up. And I went inside, and we were fortunate to take photographs of the grave of the Gaon of Vilna, his wife, certain family members, and also a gentleman by the name of Graf Potocki, who was known also as Avraham ben Avraham, Abraham the son of Abraham, and he was a Polish convert that heard about the Gaon of Vilna and heard about the Jewish people, converted to Judaism. But because his family was so upset that he had converted, they hunted him down and actually burnt him at the stake at the university in Vilna. The greatest accolade that the Jewish community could show him would be to bury him next to the Gaon of Vilna, and that's where his remains are to this very day. Outside Vilna is the Ponar forest, and when we went through the forest, we were shown massive pits that were actually built by the Russians because they were going to use them as storage chambers for fuel. However, the Russians were defeated, the Germans came into Lithuania, and they used those pits to bury the Jews of Vilna. They took them out in trucks, or they marched them out of Vilna, and they shot them before execution squads, and their bodies then rolled into the pits, and they were covered over with lime so that the lime would disintegrate the bodies. From the time that Lithuania became independent, there was no indication that there were victims of fascism that had been buried in the forest. Later, the Jews were given permission, and they have now erected suitable memorials to indicate that the majority of the people that were buried in the forest were Jews. Innocent men, women, and children that were marched out by the Nazis during the Second World War. We then went to Kovna, also known as Kaunas, and we were taken to the 9th fort. There were 9 fortifications that were built by the Russians around Kovna to protect the city at the time of the First World War. However, they were useless then, but unfortunately when they fell into the hands of the Nazis, when they came into Lithuania in approximately 1940-1941, the fortifications were used as death chambers for the Jews. They were marched to these forts, they were executed and buried in mass graves. It's interesting to note that most of the Jews of Lithuania were killed in mass graves outside the towns in which they had lived for centuries with their Lithuanian neighbors, unlike many of the Polish Jews and other East European Jews that were put onto cattle trucks and taken to the major death camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau, and others. There is also a large synagogue in Kovna, which is also known as the Chor Shul, which really means the choir shul. So I imagine that they had beautiful choirs in both synagogues, as we have in the big synagogues that we have in South Africa today. And Slobodka was famous also for the Slobodka Yeshiva, which was in a separate building. In the early 1920s, the Slobodka Yeshiva opened up a branch in Hebron in Israel. Unfortunately, in 1929 there were Arab riots, and all the people in the yeshiva were slaughtered by the Arabs. Later on, the Slobodka Yeshiva opened up in Jerusalem, and is today a branch in Bnei Brak near Tel Aviv. So although the people were murdered in Lithuania, we are grateful that there were those that survived by leaving earlier, or those that survived after the war and came to Israel or America and re-established the centers of learning to bring back the Jewish excellence that represented the Torah community of Lithuania. We also went to one of the typical towns of Lithuania, a little place called Vilki, and I saw the wooden houses that my late grandmother, Boba Bela, had described to me when she used to tell me stories after school when I came home, and she recounted her experiences in Lithuania before she came here. And she also described not only the wooden houses, but the sandy streets that would turn to mud in the rain, and it was referred to as blotter. And it was quite remarkable that when I went to Vilki, whatever I had had in my imagination, actually I saw coming to life, so to speak, with the wooden houses and the blotter in the streets. And that's quite an amazing thing when one travels through Lithuania. It's literally like being in a time capsule where you can go back perhaps a century and still see the Städtlach, the towns as they were, and I even saw horse-drawn carts, as I'm sure that my grandfather and great-grandfather saw in the towns. I met a lady by the name of Mrs. Katz, and she served us gefilte fish and chopped herring. Now, for the Lithuanian Jews, these are two delicacies that we know well, that is often served at the table on Jewish holidays. And the way that she had prepared it and the way that she had presented it was exactly the same way that we do in South Africa. And the gefilte fish we also ate with horseradish, which is exactly as we do here. And when I remarked that this is exactly the way we did it in South Africa, she said to me in Yiddish, "And where do you think they got it from in South Africa? This is where it comes from." Going to Lithuania was a real privilege, and I look forward to taking other trips to Lithuania to really walk in the steps of our forefathers, because I truly believe that one cannot understand the present or hope to go into the future without understanding where one comes from, the people, the culture, and the value system into which we have been born.
Welcome back. Continuing our series of righteous women from the Bible, Rebbetzin Knopf chats to us about a lesser-known biblical figure, Rahab, who, like Joshua before, takes matters into her own hands and plays a pivotal role in ensuring the Jewish people's entry into the Promised Land.
Today I'll be speaking about a woman biblical character called Rahab. Rahab is found in the book of Joshua that comes straight after the 5 books of Moses. During this time, Joshua is now in charge of the Jewish people. Moses was not allowed into the land of Israel because he made a mistake and he hit the rock instead of speaking to it. Joshua was the next in line for leadership. They're at the moment standing across the Jordan River. Joshua sends 2 spies to cross the Jordan River into the land of Canaan to see who was dwelling there at the time and what battle had to happen and what they would be confronting. The 2 spies go in the dead of night across the river. They end up near the walls of Jericho. It's nighttime, so they decide to stop. They see an inn, so they enter an inn, and they find a woman called Rahab. She was actually a prostitute, and she had a brothel that was disguised as an inn. The 2 spies stayed there overnight. In the morning, the king of Jericho finds out that there are 2 spies coming from the people of Israel who are spying out the land of Canaan. He knew this was going to happen and he was frightened. So he sent 2 guards to find these 2 spies in order to kill them. They passed along and they found Rahab's inn. They knocked on the door. They see Rahab and they say, "I hear there's 2 spies who are here staying overnight. Please tell me where they are." Rahab admitted that they had stayed here overnight, but she convinced them that they'd left. She says to them, "Go, quick, you might be able to chase after them. They've gone. Try and find them now." She was so convincing, and she knew at that point she had to save their lives. So she told them, in the most authentic way, to go and chase after the 2 spies. She then, once the coast was clear, went up into the rooftop and spoke to the 2 spies. She mentioned to them that these 2 guards were looking for them. They turned around and said, "You're not from our nation. How is it that you've just saved our lives? How is it that you put your life on the line in order to save us?" She responds. She says, "I heard about you. I heard about your God. I heard about the miracles that your God did for you, the splitting of the sea, the plagues, the manna, the food from heaven. I believe in your God. I believe in you and the Jewish people." The 2 spies couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that this Gentile lady had saved their lives. So they asked in return, "What can we do in order to repay you for this amazing act of kindness? You risked your life to save us." Rahab asks in return, "Please, if you come in and you fight battle with the Canaanites and the king of Jericho, please save me and my family." They agreed. She then lowers them with a red rope outside of her window so they can escape safely and return back to the Jewish people across the Jordan River. She then asks, "How will you know to save my home and my family?" They reply as they're climbing out the window, "Everyone outside of this home will be killed. But if you tie this red rope to your window, we will know to save all the inhabitants living in this house." They escaped using this red rope that Rahab so kindly gave them and returned back to the Jewish people. Rahab then tied this red rope to her window and knew that they had a deal and knew she would be saved. How amazing. What a righteous Gentile. A righteous Gentile that saw the God of the Jewish people and saw how almighty he is and saw how kind and compassionate he is and said, "These are people of that God, then I respect them and I respect what they stand for and they deserve to be saved." And these 2 spies that were connected to this God, she felt she had to save. She even put her life at risk to save them, knowing deep down that she would be merited and saved as well. Rahab merits to have a son who becomes the father of King David, which is the direct line to the Messiah. I would like to take this opportunity to thank from the bottom of my heart all the righteous Gentiles and their families for saving the Jews during the time of the Holocaust, for risking their lives for the Jewish people. I would also like to thank all the people in history that have ever risked their lives for the Jewish people and saved them, and all the people in the future that will be doing the same. I thank you.
Well, that's all we have for this week's episode of Simcha, a celebration of life. As always, we'd love to hear from you, so please send us a Facebook message at Spirit Sister Productions. From me, Aaron Halevi, and the Simcha team, have a great week ahead.